Hi everybody, like she said, my name is Tegan Bristow and I'm from South Africa, and I'll be moderating these two wonderful people today, Ng'endo and Trevor. We did lose somebody on the program. Sally Robbie Kane from Senegal wasn't able to make it and join us today, unfortunately. Just as a matter of quick introduction to myself and my position, before we move on to the artists, I'm just going to show you a very quick video of my festival, the Fak'ugesi Festival. Some of you may not be aware that there is an electronic arts festival in South Africa, and this is really just a minute. Okay, so our festival is very much focused on developing content, but also skills exchange and focus on African content, technology, arts content. Before we start the discussion around the question that was posed here, I'm just going to let Ng'endo introduce herself quickly.
My name is Ng'endo Mukii. I'm a Nairobi-based director. I work in mixed media, mostly documentary animation, but also printmaking, drawing. So I am here because last year I made my first 360 film called Nairobi Berries, and these are stills that you're seeing from the film, and it also has some animation which I integrated into the 360 space. So that's the reason I'm here, and you can also watch Nairobi Berries in the VR program too downstairs.
Hello everybody. I live in Nairobi. I've lived there for about 10 years. I'm here as well because I made a film with that guy over there, Sam Wilson. We Who Remain. It's on the war in Sudan. And I'm very happy to be here. We're a very small setup, but small but intense.
Great. Do you want to show any of that short video?
Yeah. Je travaille pour une organisation.
Yeah, I work for an organization.
Nouveaux reports.
Do you mind speaking in English?
Yeah,
just
it's
for me,
called
so I don't understand what you're saying?
Nouveaux reports, and it's we can play a quick video that introduces it.
Generations of Sudanese have grown up in conflict. Violence which the government hides from the world and its own people. We are bringing light to an invisible war. The journalists of Nouveaux reports are victims of this war. They are refugees, their families displaced, and their dreams for the future delayed. But they are also young people who have chosen to document what is happening to their homeland so that you can know about it, so that governments can act, media can report, and history is recorded. They work on the front lines of the battlefields, in refugee camps and remote villages, places where NGOs and journalists are banned. Using GPS data and video, they saw the reality on the ground, often at great danger. Help them tell their stories, make it news.
Maybe I'll just say a very brief word about that myself. So I've been a photojournalist for a long time and documentary filmmaker. this project that I worked with local journalists on the ground in Sudan's conflict zones and regions that had been aligned with the South. When the South became independent, war broke out again in these areas. So this project was kind of a way to keep the light on and keep attention focused on a conflict that is easily forgotten. And the virtual reality project arose out of that as a way to kind of find new ways to tell these stories, which is what I'm particularly interested in.
Okay, super, thanks. Thank you too. All right, so the question that we've been asked to discuss today between us, and we're hoping to hopefully get this a bit interactive and have you asking us questions too, is can VR creations make us see Africa in a new light? So yesterday, the three of us sat down and kind of looked at this question. It is not a question that we chose, just by the way, and we were kind of quite critical of this particular question. And first up, it was really because can VR creations make us see Africa in a new light? And we were wondering, who is the us that this question is posing? And I assume it's people who are in France, who are not in Africa, so clearly we're not the ones who are meant to be answering this question. But what it did do was make us think quite a lot about the methods of production that exist and how us as makers on the continent are really kind of challenging that space. And rather than for so long, the continent has been the sort of subject of European gaze, and for so long, that's the view that people have seen of the continent. And really what we try and do now is kind of have a methodological shift that allows people on the continent to be telling their own stories. How that happens is ways of working with communities in different ways, which Trevor spoke to briefly, telling stories from our own very, very personal perspectives, engaging with each other about our own stories rather than being viewed from the outside. So I think what I'm going to do is just ask Ng'endo and Trevor just to quickly speak to that and the kind of methodological and community concerns around how they make the work and the sort of content that comes from that, from their own perspectives.
Okay. So Tegan, you always talk in a way that I don't talk. So
I'm sorry. You can translate that.
Okay. So yeah, as she mentioned, the first question about how do we change the view on Africa? We found this. Personally, I found this question confusing because I am located outside of this us that is being asked to change its perspective. And I don't feel that it's a responsibility of Africans to try to change the view of other people, the view that other people have in terms of the way that they perceive us. So on my part, when I'm making my films, if you just like do the slide, if you don't mind. For my part, when I'm making films, I'm really making them for my own enjoyment. So I have really personal stories that I am telling. There are some of my films which are documentary animation that will use my family members, and we'll have discussions, and I'll record the conversation, and then I'll animate the conversation that I've had with my family members. And I find this really therapeutic. And I think it's a very different perspective in terms of the way the West tends to look at Africa is at like news stories. But my stories are personal interpretations of my own life experience. So like for Nairobi Berries, what I did is I wrote a poem. Like the beginning of the project was really complicated. So I got a grant to make this film. And I wanted to make a different, to show Nairobi in a different way. And it was really difficult for me to also myself break out of the stereotypes of here is the biggest slum in Africa, here are the mountains of Africa, here are the animals of Africa, here are the people of Africa. It was difficult for me to break out of this perspective as well. And so what I decided to do was to return to the personal perspective, and I wrote a poem. This has gone off. And I wrote a poem about... It's on a loop. So I wrote a poem about Nairobi and my different emotions that I experience while I live there. So Nairobi can be a very gritty and difficult city to live in, but it's also the sort of foundation of my entire existence, and it's where I go to sort of refuel my creative drive. So I wrote this poem, and then I tried to search for imagery that would reflect the feelings of the poem rather than try to realistically describe them. So Nairobi Berries ends up being a very sort of magical, personal, intimate space, and you experience it more as a dreamscape rather than, you know, a realistic experience of you have been in Nairobi and you have seen the things that people regularly show on TV concerning Africa. So it's a personal experience from my side. So what I'm doing is allowing you into my own mental and emotional space. And I think in terms of that question, if you agree to come into my mental space, then you can see Africa or Kenya from where I see it. So these sort of images aren't what you would expect of a film about Nairobi, and yet this is my Nairobi. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ng'endo. Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to this. I'll let Trevor speak first. But there's a level of specificity that we have to engage when we're speaking about the African continent. There's a sense that the whole of Africa is one same place. And interestingly enough, both Trevor and Ng'endo are from Nairobi, and I'm from South Africa, so two very distinct spaces. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have been a journalist for a long time and a foreign correspondent. I'm originally from Washington State in a small island in the United States, and you know, my job was to go to Africa and kind of translate what was happening for people in America to kind of know what was going on in the world. At least that was kind of the contract as I knew it. Obviously, there's a lot of problems with that and complications with that, and it became, I guess, kind of untenable for my work pretty quickly, and I think it's become untenable for the industry of people that do that. I think there's economic issues, and I think there's fundamental issues of representation, and I think that we are entering a really exciting phase right now where that's being challenged. It's being challenged in Africa. It's being challenged outside of Africa, and we're kind of what we accept as norms and of how we represent other places is changing. I mean, and as a photographer, like there's a couple images here from portraits, places I've been in Libya, South Sudan, and you know, there's a question that kind of comes up. So when you take a photograph of say, you know, this is a photograph right here of Somalia, Lido Beach, a place that's torn apart by suicide bombs constantly. It's full of Al-Shabaab. It's full of war. It's also full of life and a beach where people hang out and go swimming and joke around and do all those things that we all do. Editors don't really want to hear that. It's hard to sell that because that narrative is not fit into kind of the world, or our worldview of Africa. So sorry, I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but just to go back to that fundamental question of like, so when we are photographing or trying to learn about another place without much involvement of kind of the people that live there, we come up with a problem. We come up with a massive gap in reality. And I think there's few places in the world that have such a large gap between what is and what we think what is, or what we want to be what is. And I think as a journalist, it became quite absurd at a certain point, you know, where you are talking to people that have so many eons of stereotypes and preconceptions and ideas of a place that fulfills a fantasy and an idea that perpetuates a certain way the world is, that it's almost impossible to kind of essentially cut through that, you know. And as a photographer, it comes to a point where you take a photograph of an African man with a gun, and it's a photograph that documents an event that's happening. Maybe there's a battle or something like that. And that's important for the world to know about, it's important for people to know about, but at the same time, you are perpetuating an idea we have of a place that is not in balance, and that is promoting a myth that is not true, that is damaging. So what do you do? Do you take that picture? Do you not take that picture? And I think that conversation urgently needs to happen right now, because, yeah, when you live in a world where you are you know, when you believe in a thing that is so far from the truth, I think it puts everybody in kind of a difficult situation. But I also think, just to take it back to this question, you know, what's been most exciting for me in Nairobi has been, you know, the stories that are being told between other Nairobians, between Nairobians and people in Kampala, and this is where I think that we're going to find, you know, I guess what's interesting next.
I think when you're saying that it's not true, it's not. Of course, the man who is standing there with a gun is a real human who has this gun in his hand. But what you mean is that there are multiple truths that are out there, and it's only singular truths that are being shared. And the danger with sharing one singular truth is that it completely obliterates all other realities. So we are not allowed to exist outside of the realities that people have. If someone believes that Nairobi is only full of slums or full of like danger, then you can't get to experience any of the dreamscapes that I have, like in my films that exist. Like, this is near my house, and I live in an apartment that is one of the main roads of Nairobi. And across the street is this beautiful little forest that has that is recycling boats that are brought from the coast back to the city to be made into furniture. So I've shot in this space. And it's like 500 meters from the main road. But you will never see that on television. But yeah, it's not that the realities don't exist. Like, what you see on TV does exist, but there are also multiple other realities that are not opened up for people to understand.
I think there's very little space, you know, both in the market or in I mean, it's neat, a lot of the kind of pieces that are here at this festival, but there's a very little space, you know, that allows for those multiple realities to be shown and for us to kind of process them and think about them and engage with them. And I think that, again, is dangerous and doesn't do us any credit. I mean, I mean, I'm curious in this audience, I mean, how many people here are creators or make media? How many people here are from Africa?
Oh, we have some people.
And from France? Cool.
Is your question leading somewhere?
Yeah, I'm just curious to kind of know the audience, because I think it'd be interesting to kind of get all of your feedback and perspective on this a little bit later once we've kind of gone down that road.
What I was going to say is so one of the things that happened when mobile media pretty much came to places in Africa was the ability for people to very quickly start telling their own stories. And one of the conversations that we were having yesterday, kind of in preparation for this and speaking with you, was the notion that with colonialism in sort of modernist time also came a sort of scientific colonialism. So the idea that people would come with their technologies, take the minerals and the resources of a continent, but then also at the same time basically assumed and presented African cultures as stagnant in time, as in like not moving in time. And that was a very popular kind of rhetoric placed by the colonizers into the rest of the world, that African cultures were not interested in technology, did not want to progress, and were wanting to remain in their own kind of cultural locations without shifting. So the conversation around technological colonialism really kind of came to an end when everybody had a media device in their hands and were able to tell their own stories. So there was no longer the notion that you were represented, but there was an ability to represent yourself. And what I found quite fascinating about some of the work that you were telling me about earlier was the bringing together communities in East Africa who themselves weren't even aware of what was happening. Maybe you can talk to that a bit further.
Yeah, just briefly, I've been working on an initiative called 360 Africa, and you know, what we're trying to do is a little bit of what they're doing in South Africa, and is kind of bring together communities who are working in this space and working on these issues to learn from each other and get inspired and find, you know, cool new ways to tell stories. But yeah, we did a hackathon recently last December, and it was really, really thrilling. I think for a lot of the participants who were from Uganda and Sudan and Tanzania to actually just kind of get together and talk and share stories, because they all had preconceptions of each other that had been framed by their own media and their own issues, you know. And I think it happened, you know, from a small scale to a large scale. I think this is a constant issue we have, and I think having discussions about that and making sure that there's room for those kind of connections to be happening is really critical to, again, kind of this acknowledgement that reality is complex and there's usually multiple aspects to it. And if we don't think about things like that, then we do, again, a disservice to ourselves, and we end up, you know, in a situation like we are in America right now, where you have a real black and white narrative that makes it almost impossible to talk about the most basic things, because everybody is so committed to this idea of there being only one truth. But it's not like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the idea that young people are basically in the position to be able to make their own content, but also begin to interrogate how they themselves are viewed by the sort of globalized information economy. Because there's very, very much, I mean, just the title of this, if I go back to it, the title of this talk is very much about that globalized information economy and how there's a sort of packaging of how Africa should be perceived. And what I found really fascinating that's come out of Fak'ugesi Festival is how young people are really challenging that space. They're also challenging the technological space as a system that doesn't bring the kinds of ideals that they have in their lives and things that they're trying to do. For instance, healing. Like, healing is a really, really big movement that's coming from the South African technology sector, because they believe that the systems themselves don't actually heal or don't actually allow for communities to be together. So they're challenging the systems themselves, which I find quite fascinating.
Just a quick example of that, you know, is like, so most of VR productions that have been done kind of in Kenya have been kind of, or in the East African region, have been kind of people coming from the outside and making stories about how much suffering there is in order to create empathy, which enables people to donate to NGOs to then solve maybe these problems. Other people might call it poverty porn, and it's you know, it's not very exciting for people in Nairobi. So when we've been having these brainstorming sessions, like what people are excited about is, let's use VR to inspire people that are in difficult situations. Let's make films that are exciting, entertaining, and like thrill us and full of magic and wonder. But that's just not, you know, the pitch that somebody in New York's going to do when they're going to, you know, a lot of these places in Africa. And I think, you know, that that disconnect is very real. But I think it's also yeah, something to pay attention to.
Okay, so yeah, we've got a question on the mic.
Can you guys talk a little bit
Oh, I think you might need the microphone. Thanks, Anne.
Do you need the notes?
Yes, please. Sorry, I just yeah.
Sorry.
Exploded.
Hi there. Could you
Hi.
talk a little bit about sort of this new trend of Afrofuturism, largely inspired? Did I miss the first part? Did you talk about it this
No, we
summer?
talked about it yesterday. But,
Okay.
but yeah.
That's, you know, largely inspired by some of the recent American, African-American VR works and world-building type lab type stuff that's going on. How is that also a colonialist vision, and is there a counter vision to that?
I feel, okay, so when I made my film, I was called an Afrofuturist. I don't know if there was like a subscribe button, but I definitely didn't push it. I just found myself there. And I'm not really sure exactly what qualifies me as an Afrofuturist, or maybe, I don't know. So, again, I feel as if in terms of the diaspora, the Black American culture is very dominant. And, you know, even when we're talking about something such as Afropunk, which has come to the continent, it happened in South Africa last December. This is like, I see it as a search to find your sort of African heritage, or to redefine yourself as an African or person of African descent in the diaspora. And I find it a bit problematic because it's also very selective in terms of what will be used to define yourself. So obviously when you're looking at an entire continent, to decide what to select to use for your self-definition, you're going to start wherever you feel is most interesting. You already come from a Western perspective, so the things that are going to be most interesting to you are going to be defined by the Western space you already exist in. So I lived in the US for about 5 years, and I remember that there was what I felt was a hyper connection to like Egypt and to pharaohs. And people were claiming this sort of Egyptian heritage. And that for me was very confusing because obviously Egypt is on the other side of the continent, and also that people in Egypt don't necessarily look like people in the US of African heritage. So I feel as if this Afrofuturism and stuff like Afropunk, as much as it's an exploration and like a celebration of Africa, it's a very select Africa. Because if I'm a farmer in the highlands of Kenya growing tea and having a dairy farm, I'm not worth that celebration because I don't fit into what was celebrated in something like Wakanda, you know. And even at the end of the film, they made a statement that said, "How can your country help? What do you have to offer? You're only a country of farmers," you know. And if the whole continent is only like people who farm, you've already devalued the people who are regular, normal people.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that a little bit. So the Afropunk came to Johannesburg, and it made a lot of people really angry. I mean, it was a great party, great music, but people there kind of felt like, why are these Americans coming here to teach us how to be African? So that made a lot of people really upset. But I think, you know, one of the things, the kind of early criticisms of Afrofuturism from the African perspective is that what it did was sort of flatten the conversations that were coming from the continent. So it assumed that they were a part of this North American genre, but weren't actually looking at the details of those science fiction stories or those particularly critical technology engagements. And that's a real concern for us, actually.
I think something as simple as Kwanzaa, for example, I've never heard of Kwanzaa until I lived in the US. And Kwanzaa is celebrated as an African-American holiday with African roots. But all the people who I visited during the Kwanzaa celebrations never asked, which country does this come from? So I remember my Africanness being questioned because I didn't celebrate a holiday made up in the US about Africa. And that, like, for me, my head was exploding.
I just want to say I'm from Canada.
It's okay. Yeah, okay, cool.
There's a great series made by The Nest, which is an artist collective in Nairobi. They have one of the series satires Afrofuturism in a pretty great way. But they're also, you know, they're kind of proponents of Afrofuturism. And I think one thing that, in all of these complications, I think one thing that I'm excited about, though, is that it does feel like there's more interaction happening, I think, between kind of African Americans and places in Africa that wasn't there before. I remember going to a screening of a film about the Black Lives Matter movement, and they had just come from South Africa where they had shown their film, and they were meeting all these students there that were so, like, who had been using the Black Lives Matter movement as inspiration for what they were doing, but they hadn't been talking. You know, if you look back at the non-aligned movement and these other times, and there was so much solidarity between all these groups around in the world that was so exciting, and we kind of went away from that. So I think while there is maybe some clumsiness or something that's happening, I think it's also really exciting that there are these new networks creating but apparently also in Nairobi, Afro bubblegum is the new thing.
Afro bubblegum, yeah.
That's, I think, one of the ways, if you want to get away from these like really flattening perspectives and you want to delve into the creative industry in different parts, is like Instagram is the main, like, I can follow news in the US without ever turning to a news channel, because what I can see is people's personal reactions to what's going on in their country. There's the same thing like Kenyans on Twitter. We use KOT as a hashtag. We are severe on Twitter. So if you want to know what Kenyan actual people are thinking, though you will also get like a very middle class because of the Twitter and also in English. That's the group you'll hit, but it's better than this direct up looking down perspective.
Yeah, and there are amazing a number of blogs and sort of creative online magazines. One of them is in South Africa is called Bubblegum Club. Actually, it's really, really worth looking at. It's very based in Johannesburg. But the other thing that I wanted to say, so one of the things about a Fak'ugesi festival, and I don't mean to like promote, but the notion of Fak'ugesi festival is also to actually build a regional conversation. And one of the things that hasn't happened because of apartheid and various levels of colonialism that happen across the continent is that Africans themselves don't actually speak a lot amongst each other. And one of the things that we're now trying to do is actually build up regional networks, having more people engaging with each other. And it was what Ng'endo was saying about the Kenyans on Twitter. I mean, you should see the Twitter wars between like Nigerians and South Africans and Kenyans and South Africans. It becomes quite entertaining.
And I think another thing, you know, that's happening when you have these kind of thicker networks that are forming, you know, on the continent, and there are, you know, there's more stuff happening that comes out in the world that's interesting and exciting, and that we can all kind of connect with from wherever you are. We're going to see a lot of those stereotypes and preconceptions just kind of fall away organically. They can't hold their own against kind of the masses of the internets. Other things will come up that are problems, but like that wave, I feel that. I think we still have a long ways to go, but
yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of it's not just race, but also gender and all these other things that were previously ignored by very like heteronormative white male institutions are now being directly attacked. So you can publish something, or you can have your film and you think it's great and you spent, you know, millions of dollars, and then when it goes to the box office, you get this rash of reaction, and people are no longer, like, we are no longer silent because the way that the space works now has completely changed. So I think that's happening on several levels. It's not just, you know, you wouldn't be able to make Out of Africa now in this time and have the same reaction. Like, someone will say something and it won't be one person.
And I think Ethan Zuckerman at MIT Media Lab talks a lot about this, and about, you know, I think in a lot of places where I've worked in around the world, whether it's America or East Africa right now, there's also kind of a consolidation of power in some of these societies where you have governments that are censoring, or it's difficult to kind of rise up and make changes in your society. But what people can do is they can change norms in the kind of internet sphere, which is what you saw with the Me Too campaign. There was never any justice that was going to happen for all of those women in America. We don't have that. Our justice system is broken, and it can't deal with that. So women were like, okay, well, let's just do this as a group, as a society. And then you saw this massive shift. You know, when you watch some of these like comedies from the 90s in America, and you know the stuff that people says, we all have this lens that we now look at that and we're like, that's really unacceptable. It's not about being politically correct. It's about us changing what we believe and feel is normal, morally.
Yeah, and I think one of the exciting things about content that's coming from the continent at the moment is that there are young people who are beginning to interrogate their own systems. So the systems that are like historically colonial, but because there are historical colonial criticisms, they're also in a position to, interestingly and in different kinds of ways, sort of interrogate the sort of neo-colonial, neoliberal format that's actually coming across in the world right now. Because these are people that have lived the knowledge of insurrection, you know, like their entire history exists in there. And what we've also beginning to sort of start exploring is, where do different kinds of knowledge come from? And you know, the notion that Africa doesn't hold any knowledge is also something that's really being kind of interrogated and addressed, because knowledge does exist in revolution, knowledge does exist in culture, and what kind of things can be learned from those spaces in different ways.
I think, one thing that's kind of been cool about, I think, this technology thing that's happening to our world and to our interactions with other places is that it's changing that dynamic, and it's forcing a more partnership relationship often, whether it's design thinking, where you have to listen in order to take action, or whether it's, I just think like even virtual reality as a storytelling medium, it has baggage, but it doesn't have all the baggage that came when Europeans and Americans arrived in Africa with video cameras, and it had 60 years of creating certain tropes and ideas. And so there's something in that's I think is really exciting. I'm curious kind of what you both think about kind of technology and what, because it can go the other way as well. I mean, as we've seen in many parts of the world, like what role can that play?
So, I mean, we also, I'm just also being a bit of a timekeeper. Oh, we're good. We've got a little bit of time left, so we can comment on our view of knowledge and technology. But are there any other questions I don't want to miss? Yeah?
Hello. Thanks a lot for this interesting perspective that you're sharing. Because I'm a journalist and I travel to different festivals, and I saw already a lot of these VR projects in Rotterdam, for example. I've been also following Ingrid Kopp for quite a long time on Twitter, and she does a lot as well, travel to many festivals all over the world. And at this moment, I think film festivals are this kind of a gateway to access this kind of content. But there is always this curatorial approach. I mean, we never know as viewers what did we miss actually from the broad selection. But I was just wondering, I mean, if we go back to the topic of VR, how do these projects travel around Africa? Where can they be seen, maybe in different cultural institutes, or are there any distribution options that you'd like to comment to share about? Thanks.
I'll take that one because we are trying to solve this in Nairobi. Actually, I work with Ingrid Kopp. We did this hackathon in December, and it's the chicken or egg thing. Right now, we're kind of focusing on content, like content that's locally made for local audiences, because that's what's fun to watch. And then, I think later in the year, we're going to be looking at distribution and what that looks like. And I think the idea of millions and millions of people popping on VR headsets is probably not going to happen tomorrow. But what we're excited about is specific use cases, whether it's schools or whether it's peace-building activities to bring people together, or let's explore and play and try to find ways where this can be useful for specific groups of people, not like how can we get 100,000 people in Kenya on VR headsets, because that's not a very interesting question. But it's hard now. People are watching it, and there's VR labs and production studios and media houses all over all over Africa.
Okay, so usually when my film is playing, I get really excited because it's happening like once every 2 months or something like that. So I'll be on my Facebook becoming very like, just go watch my film. And inevitably the next day after it's stopped screening, someone will be like, oh, how can I watch Nairobi Berries? And I'll be like, So there are certain, you always have to have an organization that's involved in the screening because they have to rent out the equipment. So that on my part has like a benefit, and of course it limits the number of people who can see your film, but at the same time, in terms of making my work, I found that there are some ways to hide in my country, because sometimes I make things that are sensitive. And I realized, the Nest Collective made a film about the LGBTQ community in Kenya, and one of their producers was arrested. But my friend made an LGBTQ animated short film in Kenya, and she was nominated for an award. And this, again, I see VR as a space which can allow you to actually sort of bypass the government, because they don't have headsets. They don't understand what this thing on your head is. Yeah, they're just seeing people like looking around, you look kind of silly, they're not going to pay any attention. So I feel as if it's a like I have sensitive content that I want to explore, and I think that doing it in VR will allow me to do that, to show to select audiences, and even my own family members might not ever find out what I've said. So I see two sides to that coin.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the industry itself, from our governments and from our kind of regional organizations, aren't really geared to support distribution or anything like that. And I mean, we were chatting yesterday, but we are kind of looking at how we can work more actively with larger distribution across the regions.
And I think it's a huge opportunity, sorry, just, you know, for that. And I think it's really exciting. People are so eager and excited right now. Like, when we show stuff in Nairobi and they want to get the cameras and they're buying them and they're just like playing with them. But like, so we have this opportunity now if we invest in that ecosystem and in those people, because you have people that can do this stuff that don't necessarily have college degrees. They just have a camera and good ideas. And if we can kind of capture that, I think there's a moment we can see some grassroots, interesting things happening. If we ignore that, then, you know, we're not going to have that ecosystem. So I think it's important to kind of try to invest in these kind of cutting edge and playful things, because that's where also we're like young people. That's what they're excited about.
And I think the other thing is that we know, and this is kind of very political, we know that if, I mean, there are some really beautiful, interesting, crazy, funny stories that come from those spaces. And we know that if we don't help young people make stories in that space, they'll never be seen. And it'll just kind of perpetuate the sort of scientific colonialism, essentially. So there's, yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yes, but maybe you answered a little bit. I saw that your film While We Remain was funded by Arte. Merci. And I was just curious why you chose to do your film in VR and not for a standard Arte reportage, you know, slot, and then the film travels to other broadcasters. And,
we are actually making a reportage film that will come out when our VR film does launch on the Arte app later this year. Knock on wood. Oops. But we chose to make that film. Again, I'd been working for New Reports, I've been covering the conflict for 5 years. We've done partnerships with PBS, with Al Jazeera, you know, your typical kind of documentaries and news reports. We needed something different. We needed something that would take people to a place that was completely isolated, that was cut off, that was hard to care about. There was no political will to do anything about it. And so, yeah, this was a solution, and it's been quite a journey. I mean, I think, you know, we've also managed to take this film to MPs at the European Parliament, at congressmen, senators, and really change the tenor of the conversation about this place so that it's undeniable that kind of this is happening, this is what's going on. But we also are really excited about, you know, about Arte's reach and their ability to kind of bring this out to a broad audience. I think also, I mean, as a filmmaker and a photographer, like, there's a lot of things in that film that I couldn't have done with a camera, a typical traditional camera. I mean, there's certain scenes in there, you know, when you're with, if anybody's seen it, you should go see it, but when you're with those kids in that cave and you're looking around and it's all around you and you can't escape, and there's that, I could never have got that feeling. And I think as storytellers, you're always trying to find new ways to bring people to what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. And the closer we can get to that, the more exciting it is for storytellers, I think.
I really love the idea of your own sort of hidden networks and core infrastructures that are outside of institutions. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, what are these networks and where do you gather, and how do are people that aren't part of the networks able to access these spaces, especially if you're not in Africa? Or is it really very much locally driven kind of communities that you're talking about?
It's definitely not closed off to access on any level at all. I think it's a lot more to do with infrastructure. So the fact that the infrastructure, like government infrastructure and supporting infrastructures in the various countries, just isn't there. So you basically have small communities of people who are working together to build things, to engage, to make things, and they're definitely not closed off on any level. And I think one of the things that we're wanting to do is actually have more practitioners, well, people like you who are running festivals and doing things, coming to visit us in South Africa or in Kenya to meet those people and see what they're doing, because it's really, really hard for us to export and go out. But I mean, from our perspective, and I'll let you guys speak from a Nairobi perspective, but in Johannesburg, for instance, things like William Kentridge, who's a very, very well-known South African artist, he started a kind of studio called the Center for the Less Good Idea, where he basically just doesn't care about anyone else in the world, and he's just giving money and time to Johannesburg-based makers to explore and engage. And in October, we had a digital season of the Center for the Less Good Idea, and a huge exhibition came out of that, which then started a gallery, specifically a VR, a specific gallery. And that's just one person, that's one man's patronage of different kinds of creative individuals that he enjoys and is inspired by.
But I think those are the things that I guess this woman who asked, who's a journalist, who's probably getting tired of all the same old she's been seeing in all the festivals. I got that sense from your question, is that correct? Yeah, sorry. That there's like a need to actually reveal some of these spaces, and this was a really interesting conversation, especially from your comment, Ng'endo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name. Ng'endo.
Yeah.
Your comment around the fact that this is an opportunity for you to explore films and ideas that would otherwise not be a good idea to kind of showcase in a mass way. Yeah. And I'm assuming you're creating a set of smaller, locally driven communities and networks to share this type of content around. And those are the spaces that I think are quite interesting.
Yeah, these, like, for example, the LGBTQ community in Nairobi, it's... I want to say that it's quite fluid in terms of you'll understand it for maybe 2 months. So this is a space that I find I am in sometimes, and then at some other points I'm not there, and there'll be events that I don't know about, and then there'll be events that I'm part of. So the way that the community works is it feels almost like a reveal and a hide, and then you show up somewhere else, reveal, and you go back. Because it's it's quite aggressive in Nairobi to like openly declare that you are part of the community. So in terms of the events that happen, in terms of celebrations, art, whether it's even exhibitions, you might even go to an exhibition that is very LGBTQ and not even realize that that's what you're seeing until you arrive there. We have parties where, like, on the day you find out where the location is, or as you leave the previous location, you find out where the after party is going to be. So these sort of networks, you sort of end up being pulled into them. So I don't know how exactly. The thing though is like to, I don't want to say this, but I'm just gonna say it because it's true. People like the Goethe Institute are really, and Alliance Française as well, are really like safe spaces for different sorts of people in Nairobi. And it really annoys me that I have to point to these institutions, but they are like very safe spaces for different groups of people. So unfortunately you want to offer something. She's offering something else.
No, I mean, I think, so the Goethe Institute, the French Institute, the British Council do a lot of work with us in terms of like, because there isn't other kinds of money available. So unless people are like promoting themselves and doing it themselves, and also the industries aren't built enough to support a kind of, the infrastructures aren't there enough to kind of support big production. Like big production is something really hard to do. So I think South Africans, or some, I don't know about you guys, but often feel that they're not ready to go overseas yet, that they're still sort of exploring and experimenting, and the stuff that they do is small, even though it's probably like really fascinating for people from outside. But what I found very interesting were small collectives. So, for instance, Nest Collective, who's making in Nairobi, who are making really, really interesting bits of work and are kind of working with communities of filmmakers and builders and different kinds of things. In South Africa as well, there's another Nest called Creative Nestlings, which is basically an organization to bring digital makers together in different kinds of ways. Fak'ugesi Festival has been able to make a residency and commission work. So slowly but surely, these kind of private or kind of community-orientated institutions, because there isn't anything else, are coming up to try and help support, but unfortunately doesn't have huge budgets. Yeah.
But I do think that the question about these networks is a really important one, and when you think about supporting this stuff, finding this stuff, playing with this stuff, and I think, you know, particularly, I mean, I think what happens when people who are creative, who are interested in doing these things, is they have these kind of these thick networks in which people are able to support each other even when there are no resources. Yeah. And I think what I'm big into like task shifting in the health industry, which is like basically training nurses how to do surgery. I think we can push a lot of stuff down, and I think we can empower people at maybe more typically seen as lower levels of skills to do really important, complicated things, because I believe in people like that. And I think the same thing is true with creators, and I think with this hackathon that we did with Ingrid, you know, I think we brought in a very diverse group of people, and they went back to their communities. And the regret we had was not that we did the workshop, but that we didn't basically have some kind of support for them to evangelize amongst their networks, to share what they were doing, and to get them on board, and to train them, and to help them. And like, we're talking tiny amounts of money that will allow someone to take the time to make a VR film.
I think your question is how to access the networks, yes? So I think in terms of, for example, I could start listing groups of organizations that are very strongly LGBTQ without, but then the thing is, for example, I won't name them because the people actually don't declare themselves as such, and they don't make their films with that label. So I think None on Record is the only organization I know that is in filmmaking that is focused on LGBTQ, for example, that will openly declare itself. Africa is Out is another, but these two also have, can I say their locus is in the US. So there's also like a sense of safety for the people who are the directors of these organizations. And I think maybe one of the things is that if you want to tap into or connect with these networks is to maybe put out some feelers and they'll reach towards you. So if you're interested in that, I can be like a bridge. Yeah.
You should also think about coming, actually, and visiting.
She's going to come. Yeah, we're just going to get her there slowly.
But I mean, we were working with the Canadian Embassy last year in a very small way, which was quite interesting. So they approached us to do something at the festival and actually invited an artist from Mauritius to present at our festival, which we were like, huh? How did that happen? So they, but I know that they would be very, very fascinated. I mean, they were working in fashion recently, but they actually may be very interested to invite people to come and tour and meet and come to these small like backyard studios and actually meet to see what people are doing.
And I think just this bit of a digression, but like I think going back to this kind of partnership, you know, the thing that's exciting about I think the way that we're changing how we relate to places that are not our places is that you're having these partnerships and these kind of interactions where people are getting together and hacking stuff and making stuff, and I think when we did this hackathon, it was just so fun to have people from kind of all around the world all getting together with this common goal to like explore, and I think you're seeing more of that, and it's I think you're going to see more of that comes out in these festivals as well because of I think these changing relationships. Any more questions?
Comments? No. I mean, I just want to point out Julia, who's sitting. Oh, there's a question there. But Julia, who's sitting in the audience here, is based in Lagos, Nigeria, and she'll be basically doing an Africa-wide VR hackathon. When is that?
This will be the last one.
21st, 20th, and 22nd.
Yeah. And we don't know what's going to come out of that, but we'll see.
And it's like, how many countries is it right now? 7 countries, all doing hackathons, all hacking AR, VR, storytelling, and other solutions at the same time, and then out of that, there's going to be other people that do that, and we're really hoping to see some kind of exponential growth in this stuff, and it's so, we're involved in that from Nairobi, and it's so fun to be thinking that people in Cairo and Nairobi will be doing these things at the same time, and then we can share what we learn. What was your question?
Sorry. I was really interested by what you said, Ng'endo, about basically what I understood is that the technology is kind of a protection to you. And because my fundamental question was, why would VR creations make us see Africa in a new light, as opposition to traditional filmmaking or other forms? And I wanted to know if there was something about, I don't know, the fact that you're in immersion, about the technology itself. And you partly replied with this, which I thought interesting, that you feel protected because not many people can see it, so it can travel. But is there something else in the technology itself where you think it has another impact than traditional filmmaking?
I think in terms of VR, there's been a lot of discussion about the way that it can increase the empathy that people have for people who are living somewhere far away. And I think the danger in terms of thinking that VR will increase empathy was described yesterday during his talk when a man asked about having live transmitted from danger zone VR experiences, like 360 experiences from a war zone. And I think we are going, if you require to be so close to feel empathy for another human being just because they look different to you or have a different name or a different language, then you need to be questioning why your empathy is not turned on unless you're feeling this close. Because this man is talking about possibly seeing people dying in 360 as it happens, which for me is really problematic. That is an empathy building, that's a nightmare that I do not want to have anything to do with. So I think definitely that question for me is a question for people to reflect on and to ask themselves, how do I increase my own sense of empathy for human beings who are far away? So that's something that you sort of work on your own. Like for me, I'm not going to be trying to break down other people's empathy. I'm just going to be making my films, and then you can enjoy them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
That was fun. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.